The bell above the door jingled softly as a man stepped into the dimly lit diner. It was the kind of place that had seen better days, where the scent of bacon grease clung to the walls and the old jukebox in the corner played a tune that no one was really listening to. The morning rush had died down, leaving only a few scattered customers sipping their coffee in quiet solitude. Behind the counter, a waitress, middle-aged, with a sharp gaze and a tired expression, was wiping down the counter. She barely glanced up as the man walked in, his boots scuffing against the tiled floor. He wasn't particularly tall or imposing, but there was something about him, something in the way he carried himself, the quiet confidence in his step, that hinted at a past filled with discipline and sacrifice. The veteran took a seat near the window, adjusting the faded cap on his head. The embroidered emblem, though worn, still bore the unmistakable symbol of his service. He had seen things, endured things, but he had never expected that ordering a simple cup of coffee would lead to a moment he'd never forget. The waitress finally approached, her expression hardening the moment she noticed the cap. She crossed, her arms tapping her fingers against her elbow. "We don't serve your kind here," she said, her voice flat and unwavering. A hush fell over the diner. A few customers shifted in their seats, eyes darting between the veteran and the waitress. Someone cleared their throat uncomfortably. The air felt heavier, charged with something unspoken. The veteran blinked, as if he hadn't heard her correctly. "Excuse me?" he asked, his voice calm but firm. "You heard me," she replied, her lips pressing into a thin line. "I don't serve people like you. Take your business somewhere else." For a moment he just sat there, his hands resting on the table. The years had taught him patience, taught him to pick his battles. But this was something different. Before he could respond, before anyone could say a word, the door swung open again. The bell chimed once more, but this time the sound seemed to echo louder, cutting through the heavy silence. A man stepped inside, his presence filling the room instantly. Tall, broad-shouldered, with an unmistakable face that had been seen on movie screens for decades. The kind of face that commanded respect without needing to ask for it. Clint Eastwood. The veteran turned his head slightly, recognizing him immediately. The waitress stiffened. The few customers who had been trying to mind their own business suddenly found it impossible to look away. Eastwood's gaze swept across the diner, taking in the scene with a quiet intensity. He didn't need to ask what was happening. He had seen enough in his lifetime to recognize injustice when it stared him in the face. The air grew thick with anticipation, and then he spoke. What he said next would change everything. Clint Eastwood took a step forward, his boots clicking against the worn tile floor of the diner. The room, which had been thick with tension, now felt like it had frozen in time. The waitress, who had been so firm in her stance just moments ago, seemed to shrink under his quiet yet powerful gaze. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. Instead, he simply looked at her, the weight of his presence pressing down on the moment. Then, after what felt like an eternity, he spoke. "Is there a problem here?" His voice was steady, calm, but there was an edge to it, a warning, perhaps. The waitress cleared her throat, her hands fidgeting at her sides. "This man?" She gestured toward the veteran who sat still, his hands folded on the table. "I don't serve his kind." Clint's gaze didn't waver. "His kind?" She hesitated. "Soldiers," she muttered, barely meeting his eyes. Murmur swept through the few customers still in the diner. Some looked away, pretending not to hear. Others exchanged glances, unsure whether they should step in or stay silent. The veteran, however, remained calm. He had faced worse in his lifetime. This wasn't a battlefield, but it sure felt like one. Clint sighed, shaking his head slightly. "Lady," he said, his voice measured, "do you have any idea who you're talking to?" The waitress straightened her shoulders, as if trying to reclaim the authority she had felt moments before. "I don't care who he is," she snapped. "I run this diner the way I see fit." Clint studied her for a moment, then turned his. attention to the veteran. "Sir?" he said with quiet respect. "What's your name?" The veteran hesitated before answering. "James Carter." Clint nodded, as if locking the name away in his memory. Then he pulled out a chair and sat down across from him, his expression unreadable. "Well, James," he said, "looks like you and I are having breakfast together." The waitress's face turned red. "I already told you," Clint held up a hand, stopping her mid-sentence. "No," he said simply, his tone leaving no room for argument. "You listen to me now." The room held its breath. Even the distant hum of the jukebox seemed to quiet. "I don't know what your reasons are," Clint continued, his voice low but firm. "And frankly, I don't care. But what I do know is that men like James here, they gave people like you the freedom to stand behind that counter and make your own choices. Whether you agree with his past or not, you owe him a little respect." The waitress clenched her jaw, but she didn't respond. She had never been challenged like this before. At least not by someone like Clint Eastwood. James finally spoke, his voice calm but steady. "Ma'am," he said, "I didn't come here looking for trouble. I just wanted a cup of coffee." Silence stretched across the diner once more. The waitress opened her mouth, then closed it again. Something in her expression wavered, but pride kept her from backing down. Then, a voice from the back of the diner broke the silence. "I'll buy him the coffee." Heads turned. A man sitting at the counter, dressed in a suit, reached into his pocket and pulled out a few dollars, placing them on the counter. "And his breakfast," someone else added from a nearby booth. More voices chimed in. A woman nodded toward the waitress. "Just serve the man." The waitress swallowed hard. She looked around, realizing that the room was no longer on her side. Clint remained silent, watching the scene unfold. James, however, was the one who finally put an end to it. "If it's too much trouble," he said, pushing his chair back, "I can take my business elsewhere." The customers protested, but James wasn't a man who begged for anything. He had spent years fighting for his country, had seen loss, had endured hardship. A cup of coffee wasn't worth his dignity. But just as he was about to stand, Clint reached across the table and placed a firm hand on his arm. "Sit," he said. James hesitated, then did as he was told. Clint looked up at the waitress, his piercing gaze locking onto hers. "One last time," he said. "Get him his coffee." For a moment she stood frozen, her fingers gripping the edge of the counter. Then, without a word, she turned, grabbed a mug, and poured the steaming liquid into it. She set it down on the table with more force than necessary, but she said nothing. James picked up the cup, wrapping his fingers around the warmth. He met Clint's gaze, giving him a small nod of thanks. Clint simply leaned back in his chair, a satisfied smirk barely visible on his lips. But the moment wasn't over yet, because just as things seemed to settle, the door of the diner swung, open once more, and the person who walked in would change everything again. The door swung open with a force that sent a gust of cold air rushing into the diner. The bell above the door clanged loudly, but no one paid attention to it anymore. Every eye in the room turned toward the entrance, waiting to see who had just walked in. A woman stood in the doorway, her expression tense, her chest rising and falling as if she had rushed to get there. She looked to be in her late 30s, dressed in a crisp uniform that immediately caught James's attention. Military. Her sharp eyes scanned the room before locking onto the veteran sitting at the table. For a moment, everything seemed to pause. Then, she stepped forward. "Dad," she said. James slowly turned to face her, his fingers still wrapped around the warm coffee cup. His eyes widened slightly in surprise. "Sarah?" he murmured. The waitress, still standing behind the counter, seemed to pale as she realized what was happening. Sarah took another step closer, her boots clicking against the tiled floor. "I heard what happened," she said, glancing around the room before turning her gaze back to her father. "Are you okay?" James nodded, his voice calm but firm. "I'm fine." Clint Eastwood watched the exchange in silence, his sharp gaze taking in every detail. The rest of the diner held their breath, unsure of what to say. Sarah turned to the waitress, her expression unreadable. "Is this true?" she asked. "Did you refuse to serve my father?" The waitress shifted uncomfortably, avoiding her eyes. She started, but the words got caught in her throat. She looked around, realizing that there was no one left in the room who would defend her decision. Sarah's face hardened. "My father served this country. He spent years putting others before himself. And you think he doesn't deserve a cup of coffee?" The weight of her words settled over the room like a heavy blanket. No one spoke. The waitress opened her mouth, but no excuse would be enough. James reached out and placed a gentle hand on his daughter's arm. "It's done," he said quietly. "No need to make a scene." Sarah exhaled slowly, then gave a small nod. She turned back to the waitress, her voice softer now. "I just hope next time you think twice before judging someone you don't." "No." The waitress swallowed hard, then gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. Without another word, she turned and walked into the back of the diner, leaving the room in silence. James looked at his daughter, a hint of a smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "You always did know how to make an entrance," he said. Sarah chuckled, shaking her head. "Guess I got that from you." Clint Eastwood, who had been watching quietly, finally leaned forward. "Well, I'd say that settles it," he said, his signature smirk appearing. James looked at him, nodding. "I appreciate you standing up for me." Clint shrugged. "Just doing what's right." He leaned back in his chair, taking one last sip of his coffee before standing. "I should get going." James stood too, extending a hand. Clint took it, shaking it firmly. "Take care of yourself," Clint said. James nodded. "You too." Clint turned to Sarah, giving her a small nod of respect before making his way toward the door. As he stepped outside, the bell jingled one last time, and then he was gone. James looked around the diner. The tension had lifted, replaced by something else, something warmer. The other customers smiled at him, a silent show of support. Sarah sat down across from him, finally allowing herself to relax. "You sure you're okay?" she asked again. James smiled, picking up his coffee. "Never better." The jukebox in the corner switched songs, the melody soft and familiar. Outside, the world moved on, but inside that small diner, something had changed. And as James took a slow sip of his coffee, he couldn't help but think. Sometimes the smallest moments reveal the biggest truths.